San Leandro Community Conversations is a speaker series sponsored by the Mayor and City Council that aims to bring thought-provoking, nationally recognized speakers to San Leandro as a way to engage the community through communication and dialogue.
So tonight is a very special night for me and our council. It marks the beginning of our city-sponsored speaker series, which we're calling A Conversation, San Leandro Community Conversations. As we head into the coming months, I, along with our city council, will bring thought-provoking, nationally recognized speakers to San Leandro to try to set the stage for an ongoing community conversations. Our goal is to engage our community and with open communication and create a safe space for us to talk about some issues, to educate yourself, to learn about different issues, and then just to be able to talk to people. We're going to delve into a lot of different subjects, and I hope that you'll be along for the ride. We're initially planning about 3 events a year, so it's something that the council thinks enough of that we're going to sponsor it with some of the money from, here's my plug, OOPPNN, because of our community supporting that, we're able now to do some of the extra things that we wanted to do, and this is going to be one of them. So thank you. I'm going to thank you for the community, so thank you for that. So as we were brainstorming speakers and themes, I heard about Mr. Weiss from a group, Unity in the Community, and actually Alton is sitting right there in the 3rd row. And, yes, there we go. And I had a chance to go online, I Googled him, and I was about 10 minutes into his speech, and I said, yeah, he needs to come to San Leandro. Because what we want to do is present different ideas, different conversations, and then it's up to you to pull out what you need. As I used to be a preschool teacher, and what I would tell my families is, my job is to present you with information. Your job is to take what you need and then use it in the right way. And so that's what we're attempting to do here. We want to spark some conversations in our community. The only other thing I want to say is, as we go through this journey, my goal for San Leandro, I have a lot of goals, but one of my biggest goals is to make San Leandro a kinder community. We need to make sure that we're kind to each other, we're kind to our earth, and this is a way of starting that conversation out. So thank you. Okay, so now I'm excited to kick off our series with Mr. Tim Weiss. Mr. Weiss is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. He has spent the past 20 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states, over 1,000 colleges and high school campuses, and hundreds of professional and academic conferences. He's the author of 7 books, including the latest, Under the Affluence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America. Please help me welcome warmly Tim Weiss.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, all right, this might be a first. I think, and I should tell you this, Mayor, that you may be the first person who's ever Googled me and then said to yourself, yeah, I think we want to have that guy. It's not, I don't recommend Googling me. I don't recommend looking me up at all. I recommend absolute ignorance as to what I say and who I am if you actually want to have me come in, because normally folks would Google and they would go, yeah, no, not that guy. But it's good to be here. Thank you all for coming out. I am honored to be able to share some time with you. You know, we booked this event a while back, and I think at the time that we booked it, we sort of expected what the conversation was going to be, you know. Conversation we always have about race and some of the things that are going on in the world, and then, you know, some shit happened. And it sort of required me to sit down and, like all of us who do this work, and sort of update, you know, the material and sort of think about what that means. And so tonight I want to do 2 things, sort of inartfully perhaps, but as smoothly as possible, right? One is to talk about these issues the way that we've always needed to, because in some ways what's happened in the last month hasn't changed anything. Right? In some ways, the struggle is the same today as it was 2 months ago, 2 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago. So let's not overstate the extent to which we are now in this revolutionary new point where all of a sudden racism is real, right? Like if you saw the SNL sketch, right, the week after the election, right, where Dave Chappelle was on and Chris Rock came back, right, and white folks were stunned at what white folks were capable of doing. It calls to mind something James Baldwin said about Germany, right? James Baldwin said that white people were stunned and shocked by the Nazis, but he did not suspect that black people were particularly surprised at all, right, as to what white folks were capable of doing. And so, in a way, nothing has changed. And then in another way, I don't want to act like it's just another day, because some things have. The trajectory of our approach may have to be a bit different. We're going to have to be aware of some different things, perhaps argumentatively, narratively, strategically, right, that maybe we're not in the forefront of our analysis prior to the election. But fundamentally, all of the stuff that we now need to be thinking about because of the election of Donald Trump to the presidency is stuff we really should have been thinking about before he was elected anyway, right? And so when we think about movement building and what's going to be required to build movements for racial and economic and gender justice and sexual justice and all the forms of equity that we seek, right? All the stuff that we have to do now is stuff we should have been doing and perhaps we're neglecting to do. So now we get a chance to do that in earnest and find out exactly what we're made of and find out what this country is made of, for good or for bad, right? And so I applaud you for having this conversation, because I know that particularly in the wake of the election, there are a lot of people, and this is always the case, right? But especially in the wake of the election, lots of folks are counseling us, particularly those of us who talk about race, that we really need to not talk about that anymore because it makes the white people nervous. Oh my goodness. Don't talk about race because that is, what do they call it? Identity politics. Because only when you talk about people of color, apparently, is it identity politics. If we pander to the white working class, that's apparently not identity politics. Apparently, whiteness is not an identity. Fascinating. I'm sure the black and brown folks in this room will have a slightly different opinion of that, right? Apparently being working class is not an identity, but it is. It's an identity that only has salience because we live in a class system. All politics are identity politics, right? Whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about gender, whether we're talking about sexuality, whether we're talking about class, the only way that you can believe that class politics is not identity politics, and particularly that white working class concerns are not a form of identity politics, is to indulge what Malefi Asante calls the conceit of Eurocentrism, which is this idea that what is really particular to you is actually universal. The hallmark of Eurocentrism is to make the particular universal, so that which is applicable to white folks we just assume is applicable to everybody, but in fact it's not. We have to talk about class, but not absent an analysis of race, not absent an analysis of sex and gender and sexuality and all the other issues that afflict us and concern us. The idea that we can compartmentalize these things and appeal to the white working class as some, disidentified, entity that doesn't have these connections to other identities is a fool's errand. And so people are telling you not to have the conversation. I applaud you for wanting to have it anyway. But in a sense, they've always done this, right? We're always being told not to talk about race. We were told not to talk about race during the last 8 years of the Obama administration. We were told not to talk about race before that. We're always being told not to talk about race and, more importantly, racism, right? Because to talk about it, we're told, is what actually creates the division. If we just wouldn't talk about it, there wouldn't be any division. It's amazing how that works. It's like blaming the speedometer on your car for the speeding ticket that you got last week. Right? The speedometer didn't cause you to go 85 and a 65. The speedometer just told you what the hell happened. It's just a method of communicating information. That's what a conversation is. That's what dialogue is, right? But we act as if somehow we'd be better served to avoid dealing with the things that make some people uncomfortable. Right? But I would suggest to you that you can't solve any problem unless you confront it. Again, as James Baldwin said, right? Not every problem that is confronted can be solved, but nothing can be solved if it isn't confronted. And so we're now in a situation where we have to make a choice about what we are willing and what we are not willing to discuss. And unfortunately, our problem is not only that we don't want to talk about it, but the way in which we talk about it, right, actually causes trouble. Because just because we need to have a conversation doesn't mean any conversation will do, right? I mean, we could talk about lots of stuff. We've been talking about race for hundreds of years. We hadn't gotten it right yet. So clearly, conversation for conversation's sake is not the answer, right? It does matter what you say and how you approach the topic. And too often what we do in our country, right, is we approach the issue of racism as this interpersonal thing, which gets us in trouble, because then we end up fighting one another. It becomes a question of, well, is Donald Trump racist? Are Donald Trump's supporters racist? But the premise of that question, whether we want to state it or not, is somehow if you didn't vote for Donald Trump, you're not racist. And that racism is the unique purview of Trump voters or conservatives. But see, I remember a poll that came out 1 month before Barack Obama was elected president. It was a poll that found that some 40% of white Democrats who intended to vote for Barack Obama, according to that poll, nonetheless said that they believed at least one, if not several, racist, anti-black stereotypes to be true. So you see, if 40% of white Democrats are willing to admit to racial bias, but still pull the lever for that one black guy, then this isn't a conversation about, are Donald Trump supporters racist? Right? This is a conversation about racism in a much broader sense than that. Because there were a lot of people 8 years ago and 4 years ago who voted for a man of color who nonetheless, by their own admission, viewed the larger community of color pathologically, dysfunctionally, and negatively. The fact that you carved out an exception for that one black guy does not absolve you from the charge of racism. Just like the fact that a lot of heterosexual men in this room date women, sleep with women, and marry women does not get us out of the charge of sexism either. Right? I mean, romantic and sexual intimacy is quite a bit more, evidence of your affinity than voting, for God's sake. So if you are willing to date and marry someone and still be sexist against the larger group from which they come, you can't tell me that the fact that you'd vote for one, quote unquote, somehow gets you out of the charge of racism or sexism or any other form of ism. So this isn't about good people over here, bad people over here. Lesson number one. When we talk about racism, to accuse people of being racist in this country is like accusing them of being air breathers. Sort of one of those things you can file in the no shit category, right? Because when you're raised around racism, of course, you're going to internalize some of that, some more than others. I'm not saying that everybody internalizes it the same. But the research on this is fairly clear, right? That almost half of African Americans have actually internalized anti-black biases against themselves. So if black folks have internalized, according to that research on subconscious and implicit bias, anti-black bias, what are the odds the rest of us escaped it? What are the odds that we grew up in the rarefied air of San Leandro, where nobody ever did nothing to nobody? See, I'm from the South, and some of y'all like to talk about my people. But I know more about my people than you do. The problem is I know more about Californians than most Californians do. I know where some of y'all came from. All right? And I know there weren't that many sundown towns in the South. But now this was one. Glendale was one in Southern California, right? In the South, we like to exploit black and brown folks, so we didn't run them out of town. We kept them around to do all the hard work. That's how we rocked our racism and white supremacy. But in Oregon, and in Illinois, and in Missouri, and in Washington State, and in parts of California, y'all just ran folks out. said you can come in and do the work, can't live around us. See, so white supremacy, again, not about good people over here, bad people over here. It's not about the good American, the bad American. It's just about America. This is who we've always been. An unfulfilled promise, right? A promise without portfolio, a fortune cookie with a missing fortune. You ever get one of those? Go to a Chinese restaurant, you break open that fortune cookie. You know, they make those fortunes in Alabama, you know that, right? Chinese folks don't actually put shit like that in some cookies. That's an American thing, right? Put these strips of, you actually can see it says like made in Alabama right there. Sort of ironic, right? Like other stuff says made in China, but you actually make the fortune cookies in Alabama. Right? It says made in Alabama, but every now and then you break open one of those fortune cookies and there's nothing in there. It's like a perfect metaphor for America, right? Because we make all these promises to folks, right? We hold up these promises, and vast majority of the time we don't show any evidence of really following through. That's our problem. It's not about good people and bad people. It's about bad systems. And when you are a good person caught up in a bad system, even the best intended person can be affected by that. So we need to learn how to be, for lack of a better way to put it, soft on people and hard on systems, because the system is the problem. So we think about things like policing in this country. You could be a very well-intended cop. You could go into policing for all the right reasons, but if you get into a system of law enforcement, which exists in this country, that requires of you, as a condition of doing your job, a mentality of domination and control. A mentality that says you have to get other people subordinated to your will in order to keep yourself safe, your partner safe, right? If that's the system that you become a part of, your best intentions will mean nothing. You don't believe me? Look at what happened to this young man. You may have heard about him. He's mid-30s now, so when he started, he was very young. Baltimore, white dude, right? His name's Joe something or other. I can't remember his last name. Joe from Baltimore, we'll just call him that, right? White guy gets out of the Marines, I think it was. He'd been in Afghanistan or Iraq, one. Gets out of the service, comes back to the States, decides he wants to be a cop. His parents were both cops in YPD. All he ever wanted to be was a police officer, right? So he wants to get in it for the right reason. He doesn't want to get into crackheads and hurt folks. He wants to get in it to fight crime and help people. Great, right? So he decides to go to Baltimore and become a cop with this wonderful mentality, right? This idea that he's there to help. He goes through the training. He's #1 cadet in his class. Right? Within 2 years, he rises to the rank of detective, which is very rare for anyone to do in a big city department that fast, right? To become a detective in 2 years, but he does. He's loved by the people in the department, by his superiors. But one day, he's on a call for a suspected, drug bust or whatever. This guy was running away from some cops, and he threw some weed in the bushes or whatever, right? And he keeps running, and he runs into a house to hide. And he just, breaks into this house, and the woman that's in the house calls the cops and says, this guy just broke in, he's hiding in the backyard, blah, 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 right? And so the cops come, and they arrest him, right? They cuff him, they put him in the van, they're driving him downtown, whatever. And Joe, the white guy from Baltimore, this cop, right, is there when they take him away. And he figures that's it. He's writing up some paperwork or whatever, getting ready to leave. And apparently, all of a sudden, sees this other cop show up. Turns out that the house the guy broke into when he was trying to run away from the cops was a house that was owned by a cop. Bad choice, right? And so this cop whose house was broken into, whose girlfriend or wife or female friend or whatever was in the house and called the cops, now he's pissed, right? Because this criminal, quote unquote, broke into his home. So now he has the van bring the guy back. They bring him back cuffed. They take him to the back of the house. This guy goes to the back of the house, proceeds to beat the crap out of this criminal suspect. And Joe, the white guy from Baltimore, hears this, and he's appalled by it, right? He knows that they're brutalizing this guy in the back against all morals and ethics and law and the Constitution of the United States. He knows this is wrong. He goes home that night. He calls his mom and dad, again, both former members of the NYPD, says, what do I do? And they both said, you know what you have to do. This is wrong, and you have to turn them in. So he does. He calls the DA. He gives up information that leads to the prosecution of that officer and another officer who approved of it. And after he gives up that information, what starts to happen within his department? Well, his colleagues start to put dead rats on his car and on his desk. Pretty soon, they're refusing to back him up on calls. So he's getting calls to go investigate serious crime, putting his life on the line. He calls for backup. Nobody comes. They're willing to sacrifice him because he rolled over on this culture of silence. They ultimately run him out of the department. His commanding officer says that he's of no use to them, and eventually he's going to have to leave anyway, so he might as well do it now. He's no longer a cop because the culture of policing said there was no room for someone like him in it. See, that's how a really good, intended person can be chewed up and spit out by a bad system. It isn't about people, it's about systems. That's why you can look at what happened in Ferguson. I don't even mean the killing of Mike Brown, I mean the aftermath, right? And you watch as the cops roll in to put down the uprising there a couple years back. You remember, don't you, how they rolled up? What'd they roll up in? Police cars? No. They rolled up in tanks, decommissioned military equipment from the war zones in Afghanistan and Iraq. And what were they wearing? Were they wearing police blues uniforms with badges? No. They were wearing camouflage. Think about that for a minute. Camo in Ferguson. Two types of camo that I know of. One is green. It was created so as to help folks blend in with the jungles of Southeast Asia. And another is khaki, and it was created to help folks blend in with the sand dunes of the so-called Middle East. Y'all ever been to Ferguson? You see any jungles in suburban St. Louis? You see any sand dunes in Ferguson, Missouri? I haven't, and I've been there. So I'm assuming that when you wear camo and you roll up in a tank in Ferguson, Missouri, you're not trying to blend in so as to keep yourself safe and camouflage yourself, the meaning of the word, to allow you to blend in. Right? What you're doing is you're sending a message. And what is the message? The message is we are at war and you are the enemy. It's no different than Fallujah. See, that's a culture of law enforcement. This is not an individual problem. This is a systemic problem. It's a cultural problem. And we have to address it that way rather than thinking of this as good people versus bad people. We're just people caught up in a system that is, for a long time, rooted in inequality. And the fact is, our system has always been that. See, this is the thing. We can get all twisted about the election of Donald Trump, and I'm not saying that we ought not do that, but let's be clear. We've been faking this shit for a really long time. And by quote unquote this shit, I mean this idea that we really believe in equality and justice. 200 some odd years of pretending. So, give you a couple examples. Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, right? Says all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Didn't mean it, obviously, based on his own practices and his ownership of other human beings. But if you read even the rest of the Declaration, read the whole thing, not just the pretty parts. Like, read the part of the Declaration where Jefferson refers to the merciless Indian savages. That's in there too. They don't teach you that in school. Or read the part where he talks about the king encouraging domestic insurrections against the colonists. Who do you think he's talking about there? He's talking about enslaved people being whipped into a frenzy by the king because they would like to fight for their own liberty and not just the liberty of rich white men who own property. All men are created equal, but not really, see. Then we have a Pledge of Allegiance, which dates to the 1880s, the original version, updated several times in between then and the 1950s. But that one line, with liberty and justice for all, was always part of it, dating back to the late 1880s. And yet, at the very time that that line was being recited and made part of the Pledge of Allegiance, we clearly didn't mean it. The 1880s, for goodness sake, were just 2 decades after the end of enslavement, and it was the very decade where the Supreme Court essentially got rid of all the civil rights laws that were passed in the wake of Reconstruction and enslavement. So in fact, at the very time the government was saying that we ought not be equal and that all the laws that were trying to make things more equal ought to be thrown out, we were saying that we were a country with liberty and justice for all. I bring this up because note the word all. In both Thomas Jefferson's Declaration, all men are created equal, and in the Pledge of Allegiance, with liberty and justice for all, and then perhaps you will understand why all lives matter makes no damn sense. Because we have a very long history of saying all and not meaning it. Do you understand? We've said it forever and we've never meant it, and black folks know that. So, when they say Black Lives Matter, it's not to suggest the rest of our lives don't. Everybody knows our lives matter. I got 2 white children. They are 15 and 13. I don't need you to tell me their lives matter. I know that their damn lives matter. I'm not confused about that. But here's the point. Neither are the cops. And neither are the teachers. And neither are the employers. And neither are the loan officers at the bank. No one is confused about my daughter's lives mattering. Now, there may be some men brought up into systems of misogyny, patriarchy, and rape culture who need to be reminded from time to time. But in terms of their whiteness, there is no doubt that their lives matter. What there is a doubt, I gather, from a simple reading of this country's history, is the idea that black lives do. And one could extend that to, say, indigenous lives and lives of color generally, but let's start with black, because that has been the way in which this country has developed its racial hierarchy for so very long. And I assure you that when black lives do matter in this country, systemically, when they matter to police and when they truly matter to educators and they truly matter to employers, then all lives will, and not 1 second, 1 moment, 1 minute, 1 day, 1 week before then. So we're going to start with that, because that is the asterisk at the end of all lives matter, right? You know, sometimes you got to add the asterisk, right? That just sort of reminds you of the shit that isn't clear, right? It's like, all lives matter, yes, asterisk, but come down to the bottom of the page, quick. Come down here, look at this part, little footnote. Yeah, that means black folks too. Y'all forget that shit. Don't forget that shit. That's sort of what it is, right? But see, we have 100, 200, 230 some odd years, 240 years actually, right, since the Declaration this year, that we've been pretending. So we need to stop pretending. And we need to be clear, especially when we have people running on political platforms where their slogan, right, is to make America great again like it was in the old days. Because it was so great. Everything was cool, and then something happened. I don't know what happened. But all of a sudden, all that leave it to Beaver, father knows best shit, you know, just went out the window. Everything was fine when Andy and Opie could go down to the fishing hole in North Carolina, catch some fish, chase Otis around the jail, you know. White folks just checking themselves into the jail drunk. You couldn't have had a show with a black person doing that. White folks just showing up drunk. Lock me up. Okay. Didn't become a group pathology. It was just Otis. Because white dysfunction is always just Otis, you know. It's just individual white people. That's not even in my notes. I don't even know where that came from. Make America great again like that, see? We want our country back like that, see? These are the same people, though, that want us to forget the past, which is always ironic. Same people that will tell black and brown folks, get over the past, Why do you got to dwell in the past? They're the ones that want to take the country back and make America great again. Seems to me they live indeed in the past. They love the past as long as it's a past that makes them feel good. People don't understand how the past affects the present, but we ought to recognize it. Right? We know that right now the median net worth for white families in this country is 15 times that for black families, 13 times that for Latino families. It's not because we worked harder, prayed harder, are better at investments. God knows white folks lost a hell of a lot of money on Wall Street with no help from Mexicans, be they documented or not. Just high SAT having white boys wrecking the economy. $12.5 trillion worth of wealth. Took 235 years to build it up, and they wiped it out in 18 months. That takes talent, y'all, or an amazing lack thereof. Right? So it's not that we're better investors or smarter, right? We had a head start, 5-lap lead and an 8-lap race. So you get a 15-to-1 wealth gap, not because of merit, not because of ability, because of a head start. Right now, the typical white household headed by a high school dropout has twice the net worth of a black household headed by a college graduate. Let me repeat, because you didn't hear that in any presidential discussion, campaign, debate, commercial, but it's true now. Median net worth for white households headed by a high school dropout, $52,000, which isn't a lot, but the median wealth for a household headed by a black college graduate is only $26,000, half as much. But see, we're supposed to appeal to the white working class and their pain in isolation from black and brown pain, because they're the ones really hurting. Okay. Maybe not, right? If you don't understand how the past affects the present, though, it's not just the bright line of wealth inequality or criminal justice inequality or educational inequality. It's the very fact that we're having this discussion about Donald Trump getting ready to be president, because you do realize the only reason that's happening, all this discussion, right? Was it Hillary Clinton's fault? Was it the fault of no-show voters? Was it the fault of James Comey? Was it the fault of the Russians? Was it the fault of this, that, and the other? And all of that's in play, but here's the deal. Here's what's really in play. The fact that a couple hundred years ago, some white supremacist in Philadelphia created this thing called the Electoral College. And let's be clear why they did it, because there's a lot of bullshit getting said right now about why they did it, about, oh, they did it to stop tyranny. Oh, they did it so they could put a check on tyranny. For real? Because you know which places in the new emerging country wanted it the most? Places like Virginia. Why did they want it? Well, because a large chunk of their population weren't on the voting rolls. If you had direct democracy, if you actually had people voting one person, one vote, Virginia would have been screwed, because 40% of their population were enslaved, not viewed as people, couldn't vote. So it was slave-owning states that wanted an electoral college system that would help balance out the power of states that were not as dependent on the ownership of non-humans in their mind, who weren't allowed to vote. So when we start talking about, well, is racism why Donald Trump won? Whether or not you think it was racism in 2016, make no mistake, it was sure as hell racism in 1787, right? Because that system, which may have been articulated by Hamilton in the Federalist Papers as being about a check on tyranny, whatever. Got a lot of romantic myths about Hamilton nowadays, but no disrespect to the musical. It's a brilliant piece of art. I'm just saying. It's better art than history. That's all I'm saying. Right? But the reality is it was slaveholders who wanted that system more than anyone, because it was how they were going to allow themselves to have more power in the new system. So if you don't understand how the past affects the present, there's your card. Right? That's how we know it does. That's how white supremacy a couple hundred years back, practiced by long dead peoples, continues to reach into the present and affect us. So we don't have the luxury of ignoring it. The problem is we as white folks, even though we don't have the luxury of ignoring it, we take that luxury. That to me is the essence of privilege. See, when we talk about white privilege, some people get all twisted up. because they think that what the speaker intends when they talk about white privilege or male privilege or straight privilege or any kind of privilege is this idea that, oh, well, you must have a charmed life, right? Everything's great for you. But that's not what's meant by white privilege. No one is suggesting that white people, all or even most, have got these charmed lives. I grew up in a 850 square foot apartment. My parents never owned any property. We certainly didn't have class privilege or advantage, right? So I'm very aware of the way that white folks struggle. I'm very aware of the way that white folks, millions of them in this country, continue to struggle with inadequate health care, inadequate college access, struggling to pay the bills, to pay their mortgage, all of that, right? When we talk about privilege, we're not talking about just money and material things. We're talking about the privilege of being oblivious to other people's reality. It's a psychological state more than a material state. And the reality is every one of us in here is guilty of that at some level, because all of us have got some area where we get to be oblivious. It isn't just white folks and race. It's men with regard to sex and gender. It's straight folks and cisgendered folks with regard to sexual orientation and gender expression. It's people with money, of course, in terms of material. It's those of us who are able-bodied in terms of physical ability or disability. It's those of us who are hearing as opposed to those who are deaf, who have the luxury of being oblivious and not even thinking about whether someone is going to be there to interpret the speaker that evening. See, that's a privilege. That we don't have to think about autism, so much so that when I say the word autism, there is an incredibly good chance that you don't know what it means. But that is a system of oppression aimed at the deaf that those of us who are in the hearing community don't have to think about. And the fact that we don't think about it doesn't mean that we're horrible people. It doesn't make us autists in any conscious sense of the word, right? It doesn't make us intentionally oppressive toward the deaf community, but it does mean that we have the luxury of having one less thing to sweat. And when you have one less thing to sweat in a competitive society, right, that gives you a leg up. So when we talk about privilege, we're talking about the privilege of being oblivious, of not knowing what other people have to know. And the problem in our country is white folks have never known what people of color have had to know, and we've refused to hear. So in 1963, when the Gallup organization asked white folks, do you think blacks are treated equally in employment, housing, and education? Now, come on, y'all. It was 1963. Is this a hard quiz? Is this like quantum physics or some shit? Like, this is just real basic. 1963, Civil Rights Act hadn't even been passed yet. You know, little tip. It's an easy answer. And Gallup went out and asked white people, and 2 out of 3 of us still couldn't get it right. 2 out of 3 of us said, yeah, I think things are pretty good. For real? 2 out of 3 white folks watching the news the night of the March on Washington, August 28th, 1963. Dr. King gives that speech that was not, in fact, called the I Have a Dream speech until years later. That wasn't the real point of that speech, but that was the part white folks like. Black folks' dream, we're like, I like that. Dr. King also said in that speech that white America had bounced a check to black people and they'd come to collect on it. They don't play that shit. They don't play that every January. I have a dream that we'll all hold hands and break bread and love one another, whatever, and not the stuff about the bounce check. No, not that. Let's just keep dreaming. Anyway, 1963, 2 out of 3 white folks watching that on the news, and according to the Gallup poll, basically looking at it going, yeah, I don't get it. What are they upset about? What is all this? Why are there 200,000 angry black people in Washington in late August where it's hot? Like, why? Why are they upset? Everything's great. 1962, Gallup asked white folks if we thought black children had the same chance to get a good education as white children. And 85%, 85 out of 100 were like, yeah, I think that's about right. 62, y'all. 8 years after Brown v. Board, and before any school system in the country had actually moved to implement the guidelines of Brown to create something other than separate and unequal. White folks were like, yeah, we're pretty much done here. It all looks pretty good. Now, what is that if not privilege? The privilege of obliviousness, because those white folks were mostly good people. Understand. I'm making fun because a half century later, it's easy to do and sort of fun to do. But the point I'm trying to make is those were decent human beings. Right? Those were white folks that were basically functional. They remembered to pay their bills, feed the cat, wash their hands after they went to the bathroom. They could chew gum and walk at the same time, right? These were functional human beings, but they could not discern the most basic contours of lived experience for people of color. So what is that if not the privilege of being oblivious? The only reason they could be that clueless is because they didn't have to get tested on it. Because they didn't have to know any better. To be white is never to have to know better, right? We still don't have to know black and brown folk truth. We don't really have to understand black and brown experience with police, right? That's why we can say things like, why don't they just obey the cops? Why do they run from police? For real, you want to know? You really want to know? See, the history of law enforcement tells you why. Because historically, police were not the ones that got your cat out the tree in the black community. That's not why they came. They didn't come to give little Johnny a ride around, show him how gosh darn exciting it was to be a cop. That's not the history of policing in the black community. Now, that doesn't mean every cop is brutal and horrible and racist. Like I said, there's a cultural issue. It's not about individual officers. I've known plenty of wonderful officers and teachers and employers and doctors and nurses, but if you're in a system that encourages disparate treatment and in fact rewards it, don't be surprised when folks bend to that. You can't ask black and brown folks to be nostalgic about a history of abuse. And you sure as hell can't ask black and brown folks to forget that history, but sometimes that seems like what we're doing. We're asking people of color to adopt cultural amnesia as a positive good. Right? We're saying, forget the fact that law enforcement stems from slave patrols. Forget the fact that it was cops that enforced Jim Crow. Forget the fact that it was cops that participated in brutal lynchings and race riots, pogroms of violence against black communities. Forget the fact that it was cops who enforced those sundown town rules, both written and unwritten. Forget the fact that it was cops that ripped folks off of the stools at the lunch counters in places like Nashville, where I'm from. Forget the fact that it's cops who enforced the war on drugs, which I beg to remind you is not a war on drugs. Because if it were a war on drugs, I don't know who'd be giving this talk tonight, but I know damn sure and well it would not be me. Because if the war on drugs were about drugs, yeah, I'd still be doing about 5 more years. Right? I can tell you this now, because the statute of limitations has run out on this shit. But if it were about drugs, unless they got a Skype policy in prison that allows me to Skype in the speech, I'm not the one tonight giving this talk, you see, but like so many other white folks who the data says use drugs at the same or higher rates than black and brown folks, possess them at the same or higher rates than black and brown folks, deal them at the same rates as black and brown folks, contrary to popular belief, we're not suspected, therefore we're not detected, therefore we're not prosecuted, therefore we're not incarcerated. I crunched the numbers a few years ago, came to the conclusion after looking at the usage rates and the arrest rates and doing some math, and crunching it all on a calculator, because I'm not good with math in my head, but they got technology for that. So crunched all those numbers, came to realize that every year about 160,000 black people in America who are arrested for drugs who would not be if the arrest rates actually mirrored the rates of violations, right? Actual drug possession violations. 160,000 is the surplus number of black folks every year arrested above and beyond the numbers that would be arrested if the war on drugs were just about drugs and not racially disparate. I also was able to discern that there are 160,000 white people every year who are not arrested, who would be arrested if the war on drugs were just about drugs and if the arrest rates were commensurate with the violation rates. So you map that out over a 10-year period and tell me what you see. 1.6 million black folks with a record that wouldn't have one but for the racism inherent to the prosecution of the war on drugs, and 1.6 million white folks walking around free and clear right now who would have a record but for privilege in the prosecution of the drug war. Now ask yourself, how does that affect everything from employment to education? Because you got a record, they're not going to hire you. You got a record, you're not getting that student loan. You got a record, you're not getting public benefits of various types. You're not going to be able to vote in many states even after you've done your time. So that's what privilege means. It's not about just material wealth and advantage, right? It's about the ability to go through life without having to know what other people know. But let me tell you how dangerous that is. And see, we're seeing that right now. See, that's what Trumpism really is about. And I'm going to leave it at this. When I'm done, we're going to take questions and we're going to enjoy our conversation. But I want us to understand, because all this dialogue about, is it race, is it class, right? Is it economic anxiety? Is it racism? As if these two things were unrelated. I want to suggest to you that the only way we can really understand Trumpism, right, is to understand it as an expression of economic and cultural anxiety against a backdrop of racial expectationalism. Now, that's a word that doesn't exist, but I'm white and I have the privilege of apparently just making shit up. So I've just made up a word, and history tells me I can become president making up words. Like bigly or whatever, right? So I want you to think about it, right? What's the real issue? Are there white folks who are hurting? Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of black and brown folks hurting. Absolutely. But here's the difference, right? So it's interesting, back in November of last year, about a year ago now, a little over a year, you might have seen the story, right, about the increase in mortality rates, specifically for white, working class, non-college educated folks. And it was this weird sort of inexplicable spike, right? Like all the other rates were coming down, even though people of color's death rates were higher, the trajectory was good, right? It was still going in the right direction. And the truly poor, even though their mortality rates were higher, the trajectory was in the right direction. But you had these white, middle-aged, working-class, non-college educated white folks, huge blip, something like 200,000 excess deaths, 300,000 excess deaths, right? And what was that about? And they were dying not from just like heart disease and dying in their sleep. It was opioid addiction, cirrhosis of the liver brought on by heavy drinking, and suicides. In other words, self-inflicted harm. I want to suggest to you that for a lot of people who don't do technical opioids, Donald Trump is their opiate. Right? He's a drug that tells them, if you just take me, everything will be fine. You take me, those jobs will come back. You take me, your community will come back. You take me, your town will come back. You take me, you'll feel important again. See, that's the difference between the black and brown who struggle and the white who struggle. Black and brown folks have always have known that the system was a con, that the system was a setup, that it was a hustle. White folks for decades had the luxury of believing that this shit right here was real. Privilege allowed us to believe that if we just worked hard, played by the rules, did everything right, doubled down on our work effort, there would always be jobs, that our son would have the same job that we had, that our dad had, that his dad had, that his dad had. The coal jobs will always be there. The factory jobs will always be there. As long as you're strong, got a strong back and can lift things, you'll always have work. There ain't a black person or a brown person in this country that ever had the luxury of believing that. That ever had the luxury of believing that all they had to do was work hard and it would always work out. People of color knew better. White folks bought the lie. That's how white supremacy works. And folks got suckered. And so here we are. And the biggest privilege of all, the privilege of not knowing how your country actually operates, has now come back to bite you on the ass and put in power the very source of your immiseration. Because if you had to sum up the history of this country when it comes to race and class in one sentence, here it is. The history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their problems are black and brown folks. It's what we did in the colonial period to divide and conquer working class coalitions. It's what the rich landowners in the South did to get poor white folks to go out and fight and die for secession, which they admitted was about maintaining rich folks' interest in the ownership of other human beings. It's what labor union leaders did to keep black and brown folks out of their union, even though the unions would have been stronger, multiracial, integrated, fighting for better wages and working conditions for everyone. And it's what this man does now when he blames brown folk coming over the border, looking for the same opportunities that his family did when they left Germany, looking for the same opportunities everyone else's family did that came here voluntarily, right? We have this myth, and we keep saying it at our peril. Again, it's the privilege of interpreting history the way you want to, this idea that those of us from Europe, we came seeking freedom. And those people, they're just coming seeking stuff. Nah, we came seeking stuff. We were looking for land and we were looking for power. It wasn't freedom. We didn't establish freedom. If we'd been looking for freedom, we'd have set some up. But we didn't set it up, not just for black and brown folks. Hell, we spent most of our time in the colonies just trying to figure out who the witch was. That's how we rolled. That's how much we cared about freedom. You're a witch. Well, you're a warlock. Well, you're a witch. Well, we're going to burn you at the stake. Well, we're going to drown you because we love freedom and Jesus. We didn't come for any high-minded reasons. We came, again, James Baldwin, because we were the losers of Europe. We were starving, we were struggling, we couldn't make it, we had nowhere else to go. We need to stop romanticizing this past. We need to be honest, we need to be straightforward, we need to admit what we don't know and learn to hear the wisdom of those who have always had to understand the meaning behind the words, understand the backbeat, understand the sound emanating from every fiber of the culture, because that black and brown wisdom is the wisdom that is going to save us as a people and as a planet. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for, wow.
Thank you.
So
I'm good, yeah.
we are going to head into the question and answer portion. How this is going to work out is we do have folks, if you can raise your hand, whoever needs a 3x5 card that would like to ask a question. And just a reminder that we're going to focus our questions on things that are happening locally in our community. So we're going to prioritize those questions to make sure that we allot enough time. If you have questions you would like to give, we have our 4 ushers that are making their way around. So we'll give them a couple of minutes to run around and get the questions. Okay.
And while we're waiting, I was asked to make an announcement. It's called the White Youth Challenging Racism. A group of students are going to meet this Saturday, December 17th, in the Barberley Wellness Center from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. It's free, and a couple points about it. It's help teens get the tools they need to challenge racism and create the world they want to live in. The SLED is showing up for racial justice, are co-sponsoring a workshop for white teens this weekend in Barberley Center, but I'm sure all teens are welcome. This Saturday, 1 to 4, and it's free. And there's also flyers in the library. So I have a question, because I get the privilege. So, you talked a lot about racism and the system. So, thinking about our police and thinking, I've had heart-to-heart talks with people. How do their goal is to get the community involved, to be a community police organization. So when do you finally have that happen, or what do you judge, and how do you make that so?
I think you won't really have that until we get to a point. There are gradations of it that we can move towards, but I think that you won't really have any kind of legitimate law enforcement, fully legitimate law enforcement presence until the community gets to actually choose who polices their streets. And I think what I mean by that, and let me explain what I mean, and I'm going to say the same is true for teachers. I think that until the community gets to pick who educates their children and gets to vet them and gets to vet who's going to be a cop, same thing, then I think we're going to be in trouble. Here's how we might do that, just to give you an example of how we might move toward that at some point. We're a long way from this, but just because we're a long way from it doesn't mean we shouldn't dream it or think about it. I think of this day where maybe we'll get to a place where anyone who wants to be a law enforcement official in a community, particularly if it's a community where they don't live and it's a community that's disproportionately racially or ethnically different than themselves and disproportionately low income as well. I would say for all communities, but especially those, that in order to get to be a cop, right, you have to maybe spend the first 90 days, 120 days, 60, whatever, right, in this sort of probationary period where you spend that 2, 3, 4 months going door to door in the community you're going to be policing, getting to know people, talking to them on their porch, talking to them at the barbershop, talking to them at the coffee shop, talking to them at the church, the mosque, talking to them at school, getting to know them, showing them pictures of your family, seeing their pictures, getting to know people, right? And actually talking to them and asking, what do you need from us and what do you not need from us? What has worked for you before and what hasn't worked for you before? So that by the end of that 90 days, think about this, this would be better not just for the community, but for the cop, right? If I'm a cop, that's better for me, because now if I've spent 90 days getting to know you, when I'm out there on the street, you're not going to see me as an occupier because you've met me. We've talked. We've created a relationship, and I'm not going to see you as dangerous because I know you. I talked to you last week at the barbershop. I met you at the McDonald's or whatever. We had a conversation. So at some point, you're almost spending the first 90 days almost as an organizer, as a community organizer, getting to know people in the community before, and then the community takes a vote. At the end of the 90 days or the 120 or whatever it is, the community gets to vote up or down, like, yeah, we didn't like that one. But that one was pretty cool, and that one seemed like they were about something, and that way you have real input and real self-determination. And I think until there's real self-determination about things like law enforcement and teaching, we're going to continue to have problems. So that's where I would say we want to go. Again, it's going to take a while to get there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So, first question: how do you get whites to talk to each other about race?
Well, here's the thing,
Thank you.
we do talk about it. We just don't talk about it always very productively. I think we have to, those of us who are committed to this work, have to take the lead on that and force ourselves into those spaces where people of color know they can't really go, at least not safely. That's what SNCC told us to do, 45 years ago, right? More than that, 1967, so almost 50 years ago. I keep making myself seem a lot younger than I am. 1967, SNCC told white folks, this is what we need you to do. We love you. We know there's a role for you in this work, but your role in this work is not chilling with us and coming into our space and running our stuff, right? Your work is to challenge your people. And a lot of folks went and did it, and a lot of folks weren't down ready to do that yet. The good news is we do have folks now who are. And, in the last couple of years, as much as the white nationalist movement that we've sort of euphemistically decided to call the alt-right because it sounds less horrible, I suppose, as much attention as they've gotten, and we have to pay them attention because they're dangerous. But for every one of them, right, there are all these, I mean, 300 folks show up in D.C. for a white nationalist conference, and it's front page news. You got 120-something chapters of Surge showing up for racial justice, white folks trying to do this very work with white folks, 120 chapters trying to follow the lead of people of color, black and brown organizers in Black Lives Matter, the Movement for Black Lives, Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, Black Youth 100, Black Youth Project 100, all these groups led by people of color, and that doesn't make the news at all. That doesn't get any attention at all. So the good news is there are some white folks who are pushing into these spaces, white folks who are, literally willing to go door to door, knock on white folks' doors in suburbs and just like strike up a conversation about police violence against black folks. That was not happening 10 years ago. That was not happening 5 years ago. That was not happening 23 years ago when I first got out on the road. So the good news is there are some folks who are modeling this right now. There are other folks who have modeled it historically, going back to SNCC, going back before SNCC. And I think for those of us who are white and want to figure out how to do that, we just need to know that history. We need to study those role models and try to follow them as we follow people of color who, of course, are the true leaders of this work.
Okay. Thank you. If unconscious racism is indeed unconscious, how do we reveal and heal it in our communities and police department?
Well, the good news about unconscious bias, I suppose, is that acknowledging it, first of all, doesn't require that one take on a huge load of stigma, right? If I say that you're racist, and I mean that like in an outward way, there's a certain stigma associated with that. That's why people get defensive, right? But if we're talking about subconscious, internalized, subtle biases, one can, at least theoretically, hear that and not feel horribly guilt-ridden and shamed, right? Because as I said at the outset, we're all exposed to it, right? It's not shocking when we fall prey to it. It's rather shocking when we don't, right? It's rather shocking when we resist it. It's just like marketing, right? When you go to the grocery, there's a reason they put the chocolate at the checkout aisle, right? That's not like an accident. It's not like they just had some extra chocolate and they were like, what the hell are we gonna do with this chocolate? I don't know. I don't know, let's just put it up there where they pay and see what happens, right? That's deliberate. It's called impulse buying. They know that they've conditioned you to buy that, or buy the beef jerky, or the People magazine, or the National Enquirer, or whatever, right? And same thing is true here. The good news is, if I'm conscious going to the grocery, think about it. What do they always tell you to do? When you go to the grocery, don't go hungry. Think about what you're doing. Be conscious of the purchases you're making, and you can resist the materialistic conditioning, the consumerist conditioning. Same is true with race, gender, sexuality, religion, any of these biases we have. So the good news is, we can just sort of show people what the evidence says about subconscious bias. There's no stigma or shame associated. It's just about saying, now what do we do? And the good news, according to the research, is that when people are made aware of their subconscious bias, they actually try to do a pretty good job fighting it. They don't always succeed, but they try. So there have been studies, for example, where you take admissions teams for college, or scholarship reviewers for college, or mock juries, and you have them evaluate a trial or college applicants or scholarship applicants, and you tell them ahead of time that subconscious bias is a thing that happens, and it's it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it's just something we all fall into, so hey, be really careful, don't do that. And just giving people that heads up about what the research actually says before they get into that room to evaluate whatever it is they're evaluating, actually causes them to take more time, to be more careful, to be more cautious, right? Because they're trying really hard to get it right. So the good news is that most folks are pretty decent folks who want to get it right, don't want to hurt people. But we fall into patterns of hurting people because we don't realize how damn easy it is to do. So part of getting at subconscious bias is you drag it into the conscious mind, you make a point of it, you share that it's in you too. It's not judging someone else. You're saying, I got this, we all got this. It's a condition of being raised in the culture. And when people are aware of it, the evidence says that they try much, much harder to overcome it. The problem is when you're not aware of it, that's when it does its damage.
Okay, thank you. So we have about probably 3 or 4 questions. San Leandro we didn't purchase, we had a grant for a military vehicle, a medevac. And there's a number of questions about it, but mainly talking about what, they say it's for emergencies. Is this problematic? How do you think that we could, in San Leandro, the only person to vote against buying a tank was an African American.
Yeah.
What does that say about our government?
Yeah.
And then what do you do about people who buy military tanks for their police department?
Yeah, I just see absolutely no rational reason why. I mean, none. I don't even see how this is an issue. I don't understand why this is a thing. Because, the reality is, contrary to popular belief, and let's break this down, there is this myth in this country that crime is rapidly escalating out of control, worse than it was 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. As a matter of fact, violent crime and property crime down dramatically since the early 1990s, late 80s. If we did not need tanks in 1989 and 1974, at which time, 1974, there were twice as many numerically, which is to say far more than double the rate, because that was a smaller population. Twice as many violent crimes every year in this country numerically in the 1970s than today. If we didn't need tanks in 1974 and 1991, we don't need them today. It's ridiculous. What it does, it creates this siege mentality. Everything's out of control. Oh my God, everything's out of control. Black men are killing, Donald Trump gets elected in part by going around saying, well, black people live in hell. You can't walk down the street without getting shot. Actually, even though there have been upticks in a handful of cities that are obviously horrible and need to be addressed, the reality is homicide rates in black communities are 1/3 less today than they were in the early 90s. The homicide rate for black men is lower today in this country than it was in 1950, a time when I gather some folks think everything was great and want to make it great again, right? So we got this myth that keeps justifying all this hardware. People on the street do not have rocket launchers, therefore we do not need, because at least at this point, the NRA has not lobbied for them. That may change. But at this point, right, we don't have rocket launchers, we don't have ground-to-air missiles or surface-to-air missiles and the kinds of things that tanks protect against. So it seems to me that the downside of having that technology, which is the message that you send, that this is a war and you're the enemy, will always outweigh whatever possible theoretical benefit you could gain from having them. I think it's a way to make local law enforcement feel badass. And it has nothing to do with fighting crime. It's about taking people and making them think that they're soldiers. You want to be a soldier, there's plenty of wars that you can go sign up for all around the planet. If you want to be a cop, that's not the job. That's not the job. You're not a soldier. This is not a war. This is about community building and it's about safety. And so I don't see any role for military equipment whatsoever. And I think communities ought to reject it, ought to send it back, ought to melt it down, ought to turn it into a community garden, I don't know, whatever, an art project, whatever the hell you want to do with it. But you don't roll it down a street and try to control people with it. I just see no point in it.
It'd be good to have a conversation with you about that.
I'd love that.
San Leandro was a sundown town. What is that? Not everyone knows. And how do we as a city own this part of our history and support truth and reconciliation?
Well, for those who don't know the terminology, I mean, sundown towns are those places where, and they were different, they weren't all exactly the same. Jim Lowen writes about them in his book by that title, but, they were these places where basically black folks and brown folks could work, and they often were, in fact, brought into the community specifically for that purpose. But then at 5 o'clock or whenever the whistle blew, if it was an industrial town, a logging town, or a factory town, that's when they had to leave. And basically had to get out of town by the time that the sun went down. And there were some of these in the South, but most of them were in the Midwest, and then there were a lot of them out here on the West Coast. Some were very formal and actually had written, sort of things that made it clear that's what they were. Others were a little bit more word of mouth, informal, but everybody knew kind of thing. And so I think the way that any town that had that history, but not just that history, I mean, I think every town in the country has to own its history and engage in a truth and reconciliation. I don't like the word reconciliation, actually, but a truth and justice process by figuring out its history and how we came to be there. And that means we start, I think, by asking kids in school, I'm talking elementary school level, to go out and investigate whose land they're on. Let's start with that. You know, whose land is this that we're on? Whose land was it before we were here? And that means, of course, indigenous people, but even in between indigeneity and now, you know, there are a lot of Mexican folk that were on this land long before the rest of us were, and all they're doing is trying to come home. And the way that they read the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo says they got the right to do that. Now, that may not be the mainstream reading, but it's a legitimate one, I think. So we just need to own that history, talk about it, get us to discuss it. You can have school children debate it. You know, you can have young folks go out and investigate that. I find young people really interested in that when you put the power in their hands to go and run that process. You don't just hand them the history, even if it's the true history. You have them go and investigate it. Have them dig up the information. Have them go out and do the oral history with the elders in the community so that they can learn about the Sundown Town piece, or they can learn about, you know, whatever was going on in the neighborhood and in the community before they were there, and then they can report back. And so I think that's an important piece of it. I think it's something that every community ought to engage, because unless we have that truth, unless we have that understanding of how we got from point A to point F, then we can't get to point Z, you know, which is justice and equity. So I would start with young folks, because young folks don't have all those blinders that we have, right? We have things that keep us from wanting to be truthful and keep us from wanting to really dig, because we know we're sort of implicated and our families might be implicated. But young people just don't give a shit. It's just like, you just tell them, hey, why don't you go out and figure this out and come back like a CSI detective and tell us what you found. They'll go out there and they'll find it, because they don't have any pretense. That's what's great about kids, right? So maybe have them be in charge of it.
Okay, there's three kind of along the same lines. What do you think will happen in the next 4 years? Is there hope? Advice for talking to Trump supporters in our families and our community and so forth. You know, how do you come to common ground?
So the thing about hope is this, and I'm of mixed mind on this, and I probably always will be, right? There's part of me that takes the view of James Baldwin on everything. You've noticed I've quoted him 4 or 5 times. I think everybody should take the position of James Baldwin on all things at all times, actually. But you know, there's this interview that he gave with Kenneth Clark back in 1963, and it's online. You can find it. And part of the interview, Kenneth Clark, the great sociologist, right, asked him this very question. You know, are you an optimist or a pessimist? Do you have hope? And you know, Baldwin does this thing where he takes this long drag on his cigarette, because that was his way, and it was 1963, and you could smoke in the studio, right? And then he says, as he exhales, you know, he says, "Well, I really wish you hadn't asked me that question, but since you did, you know, I'll answer it." And he breathes very deeply, and he thinks very ponderously, and he says, "You know, at the end of the day, I have to remain an optimist because I'm alive. And to be a pessimist is to come to the conclusion that life is just an academic matter, and it's not. So as long as we have breath, we have an obligation to those who come after us to have a certain degree of hope and optimism." Now, that's how I feel 5 days out of the week. The other 2 days, and even sometimes during those 5 days, from like 4 to 8 at night, I'm of the mind of Derek Jensen, who is one of my other favorite thinkers and writers and philosophers. And one of the things Derek says is that hope is really overrated. And he says that the problem with hope, right, is that hope actually gives away your agency, right? You hope for things that you don't have any control over, right? So like I flew here today, and I really hoped that we didn't crash. But I had no control over that because I don't know how to fly a plane. So I just get in the plane, I'm like, do your thing. I don't even know how aviation works because I didn't study enough in science. I mean, I know it's got something to do with wind and goes over the wing and that kind of shit. But I just hoped that we didn't crash into the mountains or the plains of Kansas or whatever we flew over. So I think when it comes to creating justice, we don't have the luxury of just hoping. right? Hoping is what I do when somebody else is in charge and I got no agency and no control. We have to act, right? So even though I'm hopeful in Baldwin's sense, right, of being optimistic that I think we can get it together, the reality is we have to get it together. Like, it doesn't happen just because we want it to happen. It doesn't happen because the pages on the calendar turn. Yes, humanity is generally progressing. Humanity is less violent, for instance, today than it has ever been at any point in history, even though it may seem like we're horribly violent still. Hey, go back 1,000 years, go back a couple thousand years. We were a far more violent species. So in a way, we're making progress, but that it's not linear. It's never linear, right? There's progress and there's regress. There's 2 steps forward and a half a step back, sometimes 5 steps back. So I think we have to blend hope with a real concerted commitment to taking action, whatever action we're capable of taking. And I do think that we can do that. As far as what you say to Trump folks in your family, I don't have any of these, but, well, that's not true. That's not true. My father-in-law. And my wife took care of that. But she did it in a really brilliant way. You know, it was interesting what she did. And I haven't gotten her permission to really tell this story, though I don't think she would mind me at least sharing the basic contours of it. And it's one of those things where she said to him, you know, I know your politics, I understand you're conservative, I understand you're a Republican, but you're also the father of 2 girls, you're the grandfather of 4 girls. Your son-in-law is regularly threatened by the very kinds of people that are among the base of this man's supporters. I expect you to act like a father and a grandfather first, and a political partisan second. And he'd already early voted, so he probably wasn't going to change his mind in any event. But it was a personal appeal. In other words, she wasn't trying to change his politics. I don't think you can ever start the conversation there. I don't think you can ever talk to anyone shaming them for their views, attacking them for their views, and surely not just hitting them over the head with all the facts and brilliance that you have in your brain about how wrong they are, right? Because nobody likes to hear that. But what you can do is start with a very personal appeal about what something or somebody means to you in your life and how it affects you personally when someone says the kinds of things that he said as a candidate and the kinds of things that he's done throughout his life. And I think if we start with that very personal level, and explain ourselves as people who were personally affected by this. This isn't an abstract academic issue, right? This is my life. This is your life. This is the lives of people we care about. Then I think people are more likely to listen because it doesn't seem like an attack. It seems like an appeal for understanding. And so I would think that's maybe the way to start.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes, and I tried to group these into kind of the same question, and it talks about sanctuary city. Please speak on sanctuary city along with federal money being used to manipulate the dialogue. What should San Leandro citizens do to support the undocumented immigrants in our community? And just we're worried about what is happening.
Well, I think that cities and
5
towns,
minutes, sorry.
I think cities and towns all across the country are going to have to, you know, this is one of those which side are you on moments. And people are, and I mean that for individuals and I mean that for entire communities. I mean, it's coming to the point where folks are going to have to decide who we stand with and what are we prepared to lose. And, you know, I think about this not only in the sense of something like sanctuary cities. We got to have some people, you know, there comes a point where you just got to put things on the line. Other people are risking stuff every day. Their lives and their livelihoods are on the line. And so when those, I'll talk about it with regard to schooling. I do a lot of training with teachers, and, you know, teachers want to know, well, how are we going to stand in solidarity with our students who are being over-tested and over-drilled and da-da-da-da-da? Well, you got to do what those folks at Garfield High School in Seattle, Washington did, which is say, we're not going to give these damn tests. That's what we're going to do. We're not going to even administer them. Now, if you have one teacher in a building do that, they'll reassign them. They'll fire them. You get 20 teachers, and they all say, nah, we're not giving these tests. They're bullshit. We're not giving them. We're not doing it. Fire us. What are you going to do? Fire us all? You're not going to fire us all. You can't reassign us all. And they tried. Oh, they tried in Seattle. They tried to starve them out. They tried to cut their funding, but they took up the equivalent of a strike fund, ultimately waited them out. They didn't fire them, right? Those teachers, most of them still in those positions, still fighting the good fight, and they backed down. That's the kind of thing we're going to have to start doing, whether it's in schools, refusing to play these ridiculous games, whether it's law enforcement, good cops refusing to go along with the ones who are not willing to do the right thing, and cities saying you can threaten our money, you can do whatever you want to do. We are going to stand with human beings on the right side of this issue. We're not going to be intimidated. And if this town and every other town does that, I guarantee you that the federal government is going to have no choice but to back down. If one town alone does it, maybe not. But if towns and cities come together and begin to talk about this collectively, then I believe that there is a chance to beat that back. But even if a town has to stand alone, there comes a point where we have to let it be known what side we're on. This is that moment. We don't have any time to screw around anymore, so we got to start that right now. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And so a special thanks to Tim Wise for coming all the way from Nashville. Another round of applause. And this concludes our program for the night. We will reach out to you via email and all of our sites about our next speaker series, and we're formalizing that and finalizing that, so you'll be hearing from us soon. Have a good evening.